Welcome to Raising Daughters, the podcast that helps parents learn the best ways to support their daughters as they navigate the high levels of stress, anxiety, pressure, and uncertainty so pervasive in our culture today. Dr. Tim Jordan is a developmental and behavioral pediatrician who has specialized in counseling girls for over 30 years and sheds light on the realities of today's young women in all facets of their lives. This is your opportunity to learn how to better support your daughters, making them feel safe, secure, and truly loved in the midst of life's ups and downs. Here is your host, Dr. Tim.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to this episode of Raising Daughters. And I'm really glad that you're here today because I'm going to be talking about an issue I think that probably every one of you listening in has dealt with, and you've probably been frustrated by. And that issue is, how do I help my daughter when she's being bullied at school or bullied on her sports team? I hear that question a lot from parents. They feel helpless a lot of times, and their daughters feel helpless and they feel stuck. So in this podcast, I'm going to give you some ideas through a story of someone I think you know. And that person who I think you know is Fred Rogers, i.e., Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers was bullied a lot as a kid growing up, and some of the things that he learned and some of the things that he did and his mom did for him were very helpful. And especially one of the things his mom did that I also do for a lot of my patients, which I think you'll find is a different kind of way of looking at the bullying. So stick around through this podcast to make sure you hear about Mrs. Rogers and my idea. Fred, by the way, was a really sickly kind of chubby little kid all the way through grade school, middle school. He was the wealthiest kid in town. He wasn't, but his family was, to the point that he had a chauffeur who drove him to school every morning. And then a chauffeur picked him up at lunch and brought him home, then brought him back to school. Then the chauffeur showed up again at the end of the day to take him home. So that made Fred feel very different because none of the other kids had that kind of money growing up. A lot of the kids, because he was chubby, because he was sickly, teased him and called him Fat Freddy. And they teased him a lot, and he felt very left out and very lonely and didn't know what to do about it. And at first, his parents did what a lot of us do, which is we say, just ignore it, which is easy for us to say, but it's hard to just ignore it when it's happening a lot, especially when it's not just one kid. It may be a kid who gets other kids around them who also contribute. And especially today, I can't tell you how many girls I see in my counseling practice where they have a problem with their best friend. Their best friend sort of breaks off the relationship, and then they take the whole group because they start spreading rumors about this girl. They're gossiping about her, and then all of a sudden, the whole class starts to not want to hang out with them. Fred didn't have social media back when he was a kid growing up, but there was still a lot of that going on in his school. So what did Fred do about it? A couple of things. First one was Fred sought out stories of other people who also were poor in spirit, people who were being oppressed, through books, through stories that he found in lots of different places. And that kind of helped him feel like I'm not alone. That's one of the reasons why I really love when girls come to our weekend retreats and summer camps, because when we do our little circle time, girls are sharing about their experiences. Most girls, by the time they're in middle school or high school, have had a time in their life when they felt left out or teased or made fun of, excluded. And so when they hear stories from other girls their age, that they also have experienced things that are similar and have felt very similar feelings, it's magical because they start to realize I'm not alone. I'm not crazy. I'm not the only one who's experienced this. It's healing and magical when girls experience that. So that's one of the reasons why Fred reached out to books and stories, is to also find other people who were experiencing maybe what he was. The other thing that Fred did was he spent a lot of time in his imagination. He learned how to play the piano very well. He also would make his own little puppets. And he would play with his puppets and marionettes. He was very sickly. He had very severe asthma to the point where in the spring and the summer, he couldn't go outside. That's how severe it was back in that day. And they didn't have the meds, I guess, to help. And so he spent his whole summer inside. He had one little friend, Peggy, who would come over and he would entertain her with his puppets and his marionettes, which probably was a precursor for his TV show, years later. And that helped because at least he had an outlet. He had one friend he could spend some time with. The other thing was he had a good outlet for his emotions. Because like all kids who are being bullied and teased and left out, lots of feelings come up. Anger, hurt, sadness, disappointment, confusion. And so Fred said that his outlet, his refuge was his music. This is a quote, a direct quote from Fred Rogers. I was always able to cry or laugh or say I was angry through the tips of my fingers on the piano. I would go to the piano even when I was 5 years old and start to play how I felt. It was very natural for me to become a composer. All kids need outlets when they're going through tough times in their lives. When they're being bullied, they need to have a place to express all those emotions I just mentioned, either through music or through journaling or through writing stories. I saw a girl the other day. I encouraged her to write some stories, some letters to a kid who was bullying her at school. And so she had done that for 2 weeks, and she came back and she felt a lot better because she got it out. She poured out her anger onto the page, and she didn't send the letters. She just got it out. And then she did what also is very beneficial. She crumbled up the letters and she threw them away. Research has shown that if you write letters like that, that's beneficial. But if you write them and then smash the letter and either burn it or throw it away, that's even more beneficial for releasing those emotions. So Fred found an outlet for his emotions so they didn't overwhelm him. He also poured himself into his imagination through his playing with his puppets and things. And then something happened that his mom helped him with. The star football player at his school, his name was Jim Stumbaugh. He was in the hospital for a few weeks. He was sick. And so Fred's mom arranged for Fred to bring this kid his homework and also to tutor him so he wouldn't get behind. And they became fast friends in those 2 weeks with Fred helping him every day. And when that kid, Jim, returned to school, he started including Fred with his friends, with his friend group. And Fred started to gain confidence. He became very well liked because he was a nice kid, to the point where he ended up being the student council president. He was the editor of the school newspaper. He acted in plays and theater at the school. He became a confident kid because that one kid took him under his wing. That new friend, Jim, who was a football star, told all of his friends that Fred was a great guy and you guys should start to get to know him. And Fred said this is a direct quote. Mr. Rogers said, "That made all the difference in the world for me. What a difference one person can make in the life of another. It's almost as if he had said, I like you just the way you are." That became a very famous phrase of Fred's Rogers, Mr. Rogers, in his TV show. The lessons you parents who are listening to this can learn to apply to your daughters and sons, for that matter, is to allow them to have their feelings when things are going on. Always listen. You can guide them over time to have some healthy outlets for those emotions, be it writing, journaling, playing music, writing songs, dancing, painting, art. There's so many ways to express what's going on. Writing letters, writing stories, writing poetry. Make sure your kids have outlets for their emotions. And the other outlet is just the ability to have someone safe to share it with. Because talking about it and sharing about it and having people listen and say, it makes sense. I get what you're saying. It makes sense why you might feel that way. That is healing for kids. They have somebody that they feel safe with to come and share their stories with. I think it's also good to encourage your daughters to speak up and set boundaries. They cannot let words hurt them. I did a podcast this year about ways to, I think it was called anti-bullying tools. And I think you can go back. I'll put the link in the show notes. I talked about tomato words, not giving their power away. We can teach our kids not to allow words to hurt us. And that's important, as opposed to victimizing them by saying things like, oh, you poor thing. Can't believe they're doing that to you. There's ways that girls can learn to have their own shield. They can learn to not take things personal. They can learn to smile, walk away, etc. Go back to that previous podcast and listen to that. I told you I had done something that Mrs. Rogers did. I oftentimes encourage parents when their daughter is having a hard time finding a good friend in their class to talk to the teacher and say, who's a good match for my daughter? Who's somebody you think would be kind and inclusive? Who's at my daughter's emotional level? I see a lot of girls who have a hard time finding friends because they're more mature or sometimes less mature. But a teacher who's been in a class with kids for weeks or months at a time, they have a sense of who might be a good fit for that kid. And then maybe reach out to that child's family and invite that kid over. So then your daughter at least has somebody they can start to establish a relationship with, especially out of school. It's hard to deepen a friendship when you're walking around school and there's 50 kids out in the playground screaming and yelling and running around. But having a kid come over for a Saturday afternoon or a sleepover, you get to spend that kind of time, that's when a friendship can deepen. So you might be able to find that person by talking to the school, your child's teacher, maybe the school counselor. Find a good match and see if you can't get those kids together. Just having one good friend can make all the difference in the world. My wife and I have a program called Strong Girls, Strong World, where we go into schools and we work with classrooms of girls to help them learn how to get along, if you will, how to create a classroom community that they want to come to, how to take responsibility for creating that community. And one of the things that we teach the kids is what we call courageous conversations, how to resolve conflicts directly, effectively, and peacefully. And so there might be a teacher or a school counselor who can sit your daughter down with somebody who's teasing them and have them talk it through. Have your daughter tell that person how they feel and what they want. Have the other kid tell your daughter how she feels and what she wants. Have them work it out, come to an agreement. And then here's the important thing. And then follow up. I've had some kids who had that kind of conversation, but then there was no follow up. So what happened was it got worse because the kid was angry because they were called out into the counselor's office with this kid. And then they start spreading rumors and gossip and then end up getting worse because nobody followed up to make sure to hold both kids accountable to whatever they agreed to. So the accountability piece is important. There's a famous quote by a man, his name is Alexander Den Heiger. And the quote goes like this: "When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower." Sometimes what your daughter needs is for someone to work with the class. The best anti-bullying programs in schools are not the ones that address the bully or the victim. They're the ones who address the whole class, the bystanders, if you will. Because if the whole class gets behind, this is not okay with us, we will not allow that kind of behavior in our class, and they start to role play and then make commitments about standing up for each other, that is the most valuable thing that can happen a lot of times for a kid. The environment changes, the community changes, and they all start taking responsibility for each other. So you can encourage your schools to allow the time to do work like that, to teach kids those kinds of social, emotional skills. They help. They really do help. Then your daughter will understand that also that other kids will be resolving conflicts. She will realize I'm not the only person who is having some struggles with my friends. So work on the context, not just your kid. You work on the garden and the soil, not the flower, if you will. Fred Rogers had a challenging childhood with the bullying, but he learned to transcend it with some help from his outlets and with some help from a friend who took him under his wing and helped guide him to create some friends. So that's all that can hold true for your daughter as well. By the way, there's been a couple of good documentaries out about Mr. Rogers in the last couple of years, and also a book. The book is called The Good Neighbor, The Life and Work of Fred Rogers. I read that biography as well, and I think that's where I got these stories from. So it might be a good read for you and or your child if they're old enough. The article that I talked about how to help your daughter stand up to bullies is called Bullies Beware. I'll have that link in my show notes so you can re-listen to that podcast. So use Mr. Rogers' story and his examples to support your daughter in learning how to handle her emotions when it comes to being teased and bullied, learn how to stand up for herself, and also learn some ways for her to make her lot in school different, to make things better for herself. And then maybe go back and watch reruns of Mr. Rogers' show. Thanks so much for listening in today. I imagine all of you have been approached by a daughter or a son because they're being teased, bullied, left out. So I think the example of Fred Rogers and his mom will be important for you to have a better idea about how can I support my daughter. Thanks so much for stopping by here every week on Raising Daughters. I will see you back here in a week.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Raising Daughters. Hopefully, you've learned something useful about girls and young women and how to help them navigate the pressures, challenges, and opportunities of modern life. If you want to become a more effective parent, keep listening to the show at drtimjordan.com and let the conversations shape you. Build that one-of-a-kind connection with your daughters in the most profound and meaningful ways possible, shaping them into strong, confident women of the future. That's all for now. See you next week for another episode of Raising Daughters.